A missing heirloom, a marriage unmade, a ring that knows too much. Welcome to Nuits Criminelles. I'm your host, Leo. Let's grow this mystery-loving family. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your messages always brighten this channel. Can't wait to read yours. Let's begin. It was the kind of day that made one believe England was always sun-dappled and sweet. The hedgerows of St Mildred's, blooming riotously with honeysuckle and dog rose, offered their fragrant blessing to the annual village fete. Bunting fluttered lazily in the breeze, and the clink of teacups mingled with laughter and the hollow thud of wooden balls against coconuts. Children ran between stalls with sticky fingers and flushed cheeks, while their parents indulged in Victoria sponge, gossip, and gin-spiked lemonade. Miss Jane Marple, seated primly under the shade of a chestnut tree near the church's tea tent, appeared to be merely another elderly lady content to observe the merriment. Dressed in dove-grey with a sprig of lavender pinned to her hat, she sipped her tea and listened without seeming to listen at all. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Anne Hardcastle, had just launched into her second breathless anecdote about the new curate when a shrill voice called out from the far end of the green, "Fetch Dr. Partridge! Quickly!" Heads turned as one. The voice belonged to young Emily Reeves, the schoolmistress, her face pale and eyes wide as she stumbled from behind the cake competition tent. Her skirts were muddy at the hem, and her trembling hand pointed toward the hedge at the edge of the lawn. A ripple of commotion spread through the fete. People left their sandwiches half-eaten, ice creams dropped to the grass, and children were hurriedly pulled close. The village constable, a stout man with unfortunate knees, pushed his way forward with a grim set to his jaw. Miss Marple stood slowly, quietly placing her cup on its saucer. She moved unhurriedly toward the gathering crowd, standing on tiptoe just behind the Smithson's pie store to peer over curious shoulders. There, in the shade beneath the great yew tree, lay the body of Millicent Tewkesbury, well-to-do spinster, part-time local historian, and widely regarded matchmaker of St Mildred's. Her wide-brimmed hat had fallen askew, revealing eyes that stared too brightly at nothing at all. The engagement ring she always wore with antique gold and an unusual aquamarine was missing from her finger. "A heart attack," someone whispered. "No," said another. "Look at her face. She's been frightened to death." Miss Marple said nothing. Her expression was serene, but her eyes, the clear blue of a December sky, were very sharp indeed. The fete did not so much end as unravel. A few brave souls attempted to carry on, perhaps out of shock or that peculiar English resolve that insists cucumber sandwiches be served even if a body is cooling nearby. But the laughter had died, the brass band faltered, and the scent of crushed grass began to mingle unpleasantly with something else. Fear. Miss Marple returned to her place by the tea tent, not, as some might have thought, out of frailty or squeamishness, but because it afforded the best view of the entire green. From here, she could observe the movements of others, how they approached the scene and how they lingered or avoided lingering. The position also allowed her to listen. The villagers spoke in hushed tones, though some did not whisper so much as speculate. A small crowd had gathered near the trestle tables, and Miss Marple noted the usual assortment of personalities: the theatrical, the indignant, the self-important, and the quietly appalled. "It's a dreadful shame," said Mrs. Penelope Tavers, leaning heavily on her walking stick as if the death had happened directly to her. Poor Millie Tewkesbury, always so helpful with people's romantic difficulties, and to die like that, of all places. At the fete. She had enemies, muttered Mr. Charles Blenkinsop, a former solicitor who now ran the local bookshop. "You know what they say about matchmakers. For every successful couple, there's a jealous loser." Mrs. Hardcastle, having abandoned the curate mid-discussion, took a seat beside Miss Marple. Her cheeks were blotchy with emotion. "She was so kind, Jane," the vicar's wife said softly, fingers worrying the edge of her linen gloves. Why would anyone do such a thing? Unless it was an accident? Miss Marple glanced up mildly. A curious accident, wouldn't you say? For a healthy woman to collapse behind the tent, quite out of sight. Almost as if she were lured there. Mrs. Hardcastle paled. Oh, but surely no one from St. Mildred's One must never underestimate the strength of a village. Resentments, Miss Marple said gently, returning her gaze to the crowd. Inspector Arkwell arrived from Much Benham in his usual flurry of coat-tails and clipped authority. He was a man who disapproved of mess, both literal and emotional, and the death of Millicent Tewkesbury threatened to cause quite a bit of both. After speaking briskly with the local constable, he stepped behind the cake tent to view the scene before emerging with a face set in professional neutrality. A few villagers were called aside, ushered into the vestry, or discreetly behind hedges for brief statements. Miss Marple noted the order in which they summoned Emily Reeves, who had discovered the body of Freddie Tewkesbury, Millicent's distant cousin and only living relation, and Lavinia Drake, the chairwoman of the Ladies' Preservation Society. That last name caused Miss Marple to purse her lips ever so slightly. Freddie didn't look especially distraught, Mrs. Hardcastle murmured. Though I suppose young men these days don't always show their feelings. Miss Marple tilted her head. Nor their ambition. Across the green, the postmistress, Dora Meacham, was wringing her hands while speaking in rapid bursts to Mr. Blenkinsop. The man leaned in attentively, nodding with the gravity of one receiving sacred information. Miss Marple caught snippets of Dora's words, heard voices, shouted, quite cross, and stored them neatly away in that well-catalogued mind of hers. Not far from them stood Lavinia Drake, commanding in her crimson shawl, speaking in clipped tones to a knot of other women. Mrs. Drake had taken over the fete planning from Millicent Tewkesbury the previous year, not without friction. She seemed to be offering a theatrical display of indignation and sorrow, though her eyes were as cold as the lemon sherbets on the sweet stall. Meanwhile, the curate, Reverend Edmund Hale, sat on a low stone wall, looking dazed. His Bible still tucked under one arm, he stared at nothing in particular, only blinking when someone addressed him. Emily Reeves had joined him now, speaking in hushed urgency. Miss Marple noted the tight grip of Emily's fingers around the curate's arm and the way his shoulders tensed with each word. How well did Millicent know Reverend Hale? Miss Marple asked quietly. Mrs. Hardcastle frowned. Not well, I should think. He only arrived 6 weeks ago. 6 weeks is time enough to notice a great many things, Miss Marple murmured, particularly if one listens carefully. By late afternoon, the crowd had thinned. The fete was over, its remaining decorations now a ghostly echo of the day's cheer, ribbons fluttering in silence, chairs abandoned mid-conversation, and a half-sliced Battenberg drying in the sun. Freddie Tewkesbury lingered longer than most. He stood beside the yew tree, arms folded tightly, jaw clenched. 28 and recently returned from London, Freddie had been the subject of many whispers, none entirely flattering. His business ventures had failed, his romances had flared and fizzled, and he'd returned to St. Mildred's with only a borrowed car and a sullen demeanor. His cousin Millicent had taken him in, albeit reluctantly. Miss Marple watched as he stooped near the edge of the crime scene, reaching toward something in the grass, before hesitating. Then he glanced about, and catching sight of the constable watching him, he quickly straightened and walked away. Curious, she said aloud. What is it, Jane? Mrs. Hardcastle asked, startled. Oh, just thinking how young Mr. Tewkesbury might have found the fate rather tiresome. All those prying eyes. That evening the village felt oddly hollow, like a play whose cast had exited the stage too soon. Curtains twitched. Kettles boiled in near silence. And in the parlor of her ivy-covered cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting and a radio humming softly in the background. On her table lay a folded program from the fete. Scribbled in the corner was Millicent Tewkesbury's neat handwriting, a list of names with little hearts and crosses beside them. Most curious. The paper had been handed to Miss Marple that morning, under the pretense of settling the order for the jam judging. But Miss Marple now suspected it had other uses. Matchmaking was not just a hobby for Millicent. It had been her mission, and sometimes a mission uncovers secrets people would rather leave buried. She adjusted her spectacles, holding the program to the light. Emily Reeves's heart. Freddie Tewkesbury, crossed. Lavinia Drake, heart. Edmund Hale, cross. She made a quiet, thoughtful sound. Perhaps the legacy of Millicent Tewkesbury's matchmaking was not as romantic as the village believed. Perhaps it had become something else entirely, something dangerous. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, stirring the ivy along the sill. Miss Marple paused her knitting, then turned off the radio. Darkness settled over St Mildred's like a hush after a scream, and in the stillness she began to piece together the first threads of a puzzle that was only just beginning to unravel. By the following morning, St Mildred's had resumed its routines in form, if not in spirit. The milkman clattered along his route, the morning post arrived on schedule, and the bells of St Mildred's church chimed the quarter hour as though nothing had changed. Yet a subtle heaviness hung in the air like fog that had not yet descended but promised to. Gossip in St Mildred's was more than recreation. It was the lifeblood of the village's social circulatory system. It flowed freely over gates and fences, through hedges and across teacups, and with Millicent Tewkesbury's sudden, tragic death, it surged like a spring thaw. At the post office, Dora Meacham held court behind her counter with all the solemnity of a magistrate, recounting her version of events to anyone collecting parcels or stamps. As she handed Mrs. Quidding her pension envelope, she said with great seriousness, "I heard a raised voice. Yes, I did." Just before she was found. It was sharp, male, angry, or desperate. Hard to say. Sound carries through the fate tense, you know. Mrs. Quince, whose curiosity outpaced her hearing, nodded solemnly while stuffing her envelope into her handbag. Was it that young Mr. Tewkesbury? He always looked like he'd lose his temper if his tea came too slowly. Dora's mouth twisted. Could have been. Could have been that curate, too. Reverend Hale. Handsome, yes, but there's a tightness behind the smile. I've noticed it. Like someone with a guilty conscience. Across the lane at the grocer's, Mr. Blenkinsop was doing much the same, though with an air of scholarly detachment that made his speculation seem less like gossip and more like legal analysis. Mark my words, he told the butcher's assistant while selecting tomatoes. That ring of hers, the one that went missing. That's the key. Sentimental value, certainly, but worth a tidy sum, too. Gold band, rare aquamarine. There was a rumor back in '43, I believe, that it had once belonged to a Russian countess, smuggled out after the revolution. If someone wants it, well, there's your motive. The assistant, wide-eyed and barely old enough to shave, nodded gravely as though he had seen such things himself. Meanwhile, Emily Reeves returned to her classroom with an air of martyrdom. Her pupils, sensing a disruption to normal order, had taken full advantage of her distraction. 2 ink spills, 1 toppled globe, and a spectacularly inaccurate drawing of Queen Victoria. Later, she dismissed the class early. Miss Marple had taken a morning walk through the village under the pretext of visiting the churchyard to tend to her nephew's wife's late uncle's memorial stone. It was the kind of distant connection that discouraged questions and allowed her ample opportunity to observe. She saw the way Lavinia Drake flounced out of the chemist's shop, her chin high and scarf even higher. Mrs. Drake had always been proud of her posture and her moral clarity, though Miss Marple had long suspected both were often bolstered by convenience. Now, Lavinia's dignity seemed even more pointed, as if daring the world to find fault. Down the hill, young Freddie Tewkesbury emerged from the village pub just after midday. A little too early for luncheon and a little too late for breakfast, it suggested something other than thirst had driven him there. His shirt was rumpled, and his eyes, though alert, were wary. He lit a cigarette with shaking fingers, then stubbed it out almost immediately. Miss Marple paused beside the vicarage gate and adjusted her glove. "Good morning, Miss Marple," said a voice from behind. She turned to find Reverend Hale approaching, his expression tired but kind. He looked older in the morning light. Miss Marple hadn't noticed before the marks on the corners of his mouth and brow. It wasn't just grief. It was the strain of secrets, perhaps, or the weight of guilt, deserved or otherwise. "Good morning, Reverend," she replied with a gentle smile. "A most difficult day for the parish." He nodded. "I've done what I can to comfort Miss Reeves. She's still shaken, of course. But we carry on. It's what Millicent would have wanted." Miss Marple looked at him closely, though her tone remained light. "Did you know Miss Tewkesbury well?" "Not especially. Only since my arrival. She was generous in her support of the church, though quite pointed in her opinions. She had the sort of mind that catalogued people and placed them into tidy drawers." "Matchmaking can be quite like that," Miss Marple mused. He smiled faintly. "Indeed." Miss Marple nodded, satisfied for now, and continued on her walk. That afternoon, Inspector Arkwell called a village meeting in the town hall. It was not for official purposes, he said, but to reassure the community and quell speculation. Naturally, it had the opposite effect. Every pew-like bench in the hall was filled. Even Mr. Harris, who hadn't attended a meeting since the Great War, was there. Miss Marple sat toward the back, knitting in hand, her ears as attentive as any recording device. Inspector Arkwell stood at the front, flanked by the constable and a clipboard that he never once consulted. His voice was calm and authoritative. "We are pursuing several lines of inquiry," he began, "and we ask for your patience. Miss Tewkesbury's death is being treated as suspicious. We are not, at this point, prepared to label it murder, though theft may be involved." A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Yes," he continued, "her ring is missing. If anyone has information, sightings of unusual behavior, strangers in the village or anything out of the ordinary, we ask that you come forward." Someone snorted. It was Lavinia Drake. "Unusual behavior? This is St. Mildred's inspector. Everything is unusual in its way. You'll need to be more specific." Chuckles followed, though not warmly. Inspector Arkwell's mouth thinned. "Then let me be plain. If Miss Tewkesbury was seen in private conversation with anyone at the fete, or if anyone saw her enter the cake tent area before her death, we want to know." Freddie Tewkesbury shifted in his seat. Miss Marple caught the movement and glanced toward him. His gaze was directed not at the inspector, but at Emily Reeves, who was wringing a handkerchief in her lap like she was attempting to strangle a ghost. "I believe," Miss Marple said softly, as if to herself, "that people are beginning to worry about what Millicent might have known." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking rhythmically. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the edge of the fields and painted the cottages gold, Miss Marple sat once again in her parlour, the programme still resting on the table beside her. She studied the hearts and crosses anew, this time making a separate list on a fresh sheet of paper. Names, roles, and relationships, what Millicent knew, whom she approved of, whom she disapproved of, and why. She circled Lavinia Drake's name, then Emily Reeves, then Reverend Hale. What linked them, if anything? And what, above all, had Millicent discovered that had made her a threat to someone? As the light faded and the room slipped into shadow, Miss Marple set down her knitting and whispered to herself, "A ring may be missing, but it's a circle I need to see. A circle of trust broken, or perhaps betrayed. She rang for tea. Tomorrow she will pay a visit to Emily Reeves, not to interrogate, of course, simply to offer support, a woman's touch in troubled times. And perhaps, while there, she might ask a seemingly innocent question or two. The investigation for Miss Marple had quietly begun. The following morning brought a softness to the sky, the kind of pale, forgiving light that made even sorrowful places seem tender. Miss Marple, dressed in her slate-blue cardigan and sensible walking shoes, departed her cottage with the air of someone visiting an ailing friend. Her destination was Ivy Lodge, the modest, vine-draped cottage rented by Miss Emily Reeves, schoolmistress of St Mildred's, and now one of the few individuals to have seen Millicent Tewkesbury alive. She carried with her a small tin of oat biscuits, homemade, naturally. It would have been unseemly to visit in such times without a gesture of comfort. Miss Marple's gait was slow but sure as she made her way past familiar hedges and brick chimneys. Along the way, she exchanged brief nods with neighbors who were, it seemed, all out and about far earlier than usual. When she arrived at Ivy Lodge, Emily Reeves answered on the second knock. Her hair was loosely gathered, and her eyes were reddened but alert. The scent of burned toast clung faintly to the hallway behind her. "Miss Marple," Emily said, blinking. "Oh, how kind of you to come. I wasn't expecting company." "I thought a biscuit might cheer you," Miss Marple said gently, raising the tin. "And you did have quite a shock, dear. One shouldn't be alone too long after such a thing." Emily stepped aside, ushering her guest into a narrow sitting room with chintz-covered furniture and a clutter of school papers spread over a bureau. A cat blinked sleepily from the windowsill, flicked its tail once, then resumed its nap. "You're very kind," Emily murmured, taking the tin without opening it. "I've hardly slept. Every time I close my eyes, I see her face. It was dreadful." Miss Marple waited a moment, as if honoring the weight of the memory. "I'm sure it was. One never forgets such things, but the body can endure quite a lot. The mind is different. It stores details, even the ones we don't think are important at the time." Emily nodded vaguely and sat down opposite her guest. "It all happened so quickly. I'd just finished checking the scores for the spelling bee. Then I heard something odd, like a sort of yelp, you know, not loud but enough to make me turn. And you went behind the cake tent?" "Yes. I thought someone had twisted an ankle or spilled a kettle. But it was her, on the ground, eyes wide. I knew at once she was gone." Miss Marple took a delicate sip from the tea Emily had brought, but said nothing of it. She kept her expression neutral, her tone gentle. "And you didn't see anyone else? No one is hurrying away?" "Number, but I heard something. Not footsteps, more like rustling. The bushes behind the yew. Could it have been an animal?" Emily shook her head. It was heavier. "I remember thinking that very thing at the time, that it wasn't a rabbit." Miss Marple's knitting bag, brought along for polite pretense, now rested on her lap. She reached in and produced a small square of her project, eyes never leaving Emily's. "Miss Tewkesbury," she said carefully, "was said to be quite generous with advice, particularly in matters of love. I wonder, did she ever offer her suggestions to you?" There was a flicker, then something quick and tight behind Emily's eyes. She smiled, but it was stretched thin. "Oh, yes. She was fond of meddling, said I worked too hard and smiled too little. Though I ought to consider Reverend Hale. Can you imagine?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple, continuing her knitting. She gave him a cross on her list. "You, no." Emily looked up sharply. Her list? Her fate program. She had noted several names, hearts and crosses. Yours had a heart. Emily's expression shifted, a mix of confusion and apprehension. "I didn't know that. I mean, we spoke occasionally, but I wouldn't say we were close." Miss Marple didn't press further. She knew the truth had a habit of rising when left to simmer. Instead, she asked after the children, the school, and the coming autumn term. When she left half an hour later, Emily seemed steadier. The tin of biscuits had been accepted graciously, and Miss Marple departed with a mental note of every hesitation and deflection. At midday, she stopped by the bookshop under the pretense of buying a gardening almanac. Charles Blenkinsop greeted her from behind the counter, spectacles perched on the end of his nose and the Times folded crisply in his lap. "Ah, Miss Marple, still chasing mysteries, are we?" "Goodness, no," she replied, setting the almanac down gently. "I was simply thinking how quickly this garden year has flown by. One forgets things with age." Blenkinsop smiled, then lowered his voice. "Though speaking of things forgotten or misplaced, I've heard there's been no sign of the ring. No pawnbrokers in the region have seen it. Not yet, anyway." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands. A pity, it was rather distinctive. Indeed, and quite valuable. Sentiment aside, someone could have been tempted. She tilted her head, or perhaps afraid of what it symbolized. Blenkinsop raised an eyebrow. "You think the ring was more than an ornament?" "I think," she replied softly, "that Millicent Tewkesbury knew many things. People confided in her, especially about matters of the heart. Some might even say she held a few secrets close." As she turned to leave, she added, "One wonders what a secret is worth to someone who doesn't want it known." That evening, Miss Marple took out the fate program once more. Her notes had grown. She'd added side remarks, observed behaviors, and cross-referenced conversations, and while the police pursued leads related to theft, she looked for signs of something else entirely. Not anger, not greed, shame. She had seen it once before in the war widow who returned her Red Cross pin with trembling fingers, in the postmaster's assistant who'd lied about a letter gone astray. The smallest sign, averted eyes, the overcompensation of laughter, the need to justify what hadn't been questioned. She now believed that Millicent Tewkesbury had uncovered something unsavory, a relationship perhaps, or a betrayal, something that did not fit neatly into her matchmaking vision of the world. Someone had reason to silence her. But who? She considered Freddie, angry, impulsive, and resentful of Millicent's patronizing protection. Then Emily is nervous, secretive, and now quite alone. And Lavinia Drakestern, composed, but perhaps too composed, especially for someone whose rivalry with Millicent had become the subject of church whispers. There was, too, the curate, Reverend Hale, gentle, thoughtful, but reticent in all the wrong ways. 4 names, 4 motives, however murky, and somewhere in the midst of it, a missing ring. She wrote down a final note. The ring is not the reason. It is the result. Miss Marple turned off her lamp and listened to the stillness beyond her window. Tomorrow she will visit Lavinia Drake. Not for suspicion, of course. Simply to admire her roses, which were, by all accounts, in excellent bloom this year. But perhaps, amid the roses, something else might be in bloom too. The truth was flowering, slowly, and Miss Marple, ever patient, would wait for it to show its petals. Lavinia Drake lived in a perfectly symmetrical cottage on the western edge of St Mildred's. The shutters were always painted, the garden path always weeded, and the roses, those immaculate roses, grew with an unnatural precision, each bloom placed by nature but disciplined by Lavinia's careful hand. Miss Marple arrived just after 3 o'clock, a time chosen deliberately. Lavinia was known to serve tea precisely at past, and Miss Marple suspected the lady would prefer to play hostess than be caught tending compost in her garden gloves. She was correct. "Jane," Lavinia said coolly as she opened the door, her voice framed with cordiality and her lipstick precisely in place. What an unexpected pleasure. "I thought I'd come to admire your roses," Miss Marple said, tilting her head toward the trellis arch that framed the gate. "So few people grow them without mildew these days. You've always had the knack." Lavinia's lips thinned with modesty. One does what one can. Within moments, Miss Marple was seated in a glassy sunroom, surrounded by china teacups and the faint perfume of lavender polish. Lavinia poured tea with a controlled grace that suggested a life of rehearsed social appearances. "It's been an awful few days," she said as she settled into her chair, smoothing the folds of her skirt. "Millicent's death has shaken the village to its roots." Miss Marple nodded, knitting in her lap, though her hands had yet to begin. "It has, indeed. She was such a fixture, and always with a keen eye for affairs of the heart. I dare say she knew more about the people of this village than any vicar or policeman ever might." Lavinia gave a brittle little laugh. She liked to think she did, certainly. That ring of hers was practically her trademark. "Do you remember the way she'd tap it on her notebook when she had something juicy to share? Like some kind of social semaphore." "A ring like that," Miss Marple said lightly, "would have stood out to anyone, especially if they knew it was valuable. And if they had something they didn't want shared." Lavinia's cup paused in mid-air. "Are you suggesting," she said slowly, "that Millicent was blackmailing someone?" "Oh, no," Miss Marple replied with an airy shake of her head. "Blackmail is such a vulgar term. I only mean that sometimes people feel pressure when their secrets are no longer their own. Pressure builds. Tempers fray." A moment passed. Lavinia's face remained composed, but her foot tapped once beneath the table before stilling again. "I admit," she said at last, "Millicent and I didn't always see eye to eye. She could be meddlesome and intrusive. Last year she tried to pair me off with that retired naval man, Harold Jenkins. Imagine, a man who keeps seaweed in his pantry and calls every woman old girl." Miss Marple smiled. "You didn't take kindly to the suggestion? I told her she'd mistaken me for someone who required rescuing. I've lived very well without a husband and intend to continue doing so." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said. "And I imagine Millicent didn't take your refusal gracefully?" "She sulked for a week," Lavinia said, now with a tight laugh. Then she shifted her attention to poor Emily. "Sweet girl, but entirely unsuited to any man with ambition. She wants comfort and predictability. Someone like Reverend Hale, perhaps." "Do you think Reverend Hale returns her affection?" Lavinia scoffed. "He's too guarded. I don't think he'd open his heart to anyone. A quiet man with quiet worries." Miss Marple set her cup down. "And what of Freddie Tewkesbury?" Lavinia raised an eyebrow. "Now, there's a young man with trouble behind his eyes. I don't know what Millicent thought she was doing bringing him back here. She said it was a family obligation, but I think she believed she could reform him. Ridiculous notion. Leopards don't change their spots, particularly not when those spots are unpaid debts." "Debts?" "Oh, yes. Everyone knows. He failed at everything in London. Investment schemes, I think. Got caught up with bad people. She paid his rent, you know, and she made sure everyone knew about it, too. Said it was for his own good." There was something brittle in Lavinia's tone now, something Miss Marple knew well. Resentment dressed in civility, disapproval softened by grammar school manners, but it was there all the same. Miss Marple took her leave shortly after, walking at a leisurely pace back toward the village green. Her mind sifted the conversation like flour, separating what was said from what was meant. Lavinia had deflected suspicion with poise. Too much poise. And still, there was the matter of the fate program. Miss Marple reviewed it again that evening at home, noting Lavinia's name with a heart beside it. That suggested Millicent approved of her, and perhaps even saw her as a future match. Odd, considering Lavinia's disdain for male companionship, unless the approval had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with knowledge. Has Millicent known the truth about Lavinia's past? Or worse, about her intentions for someone else? Later that same evening, a knock came at Miss Marple's door. To her mild surprise, it was Freddie Tewkesbury. His collar was unbuttoned, and the nervous energy that clung to him was almost visible. "Miss Marple," he said, almost breathlessly, "may I speak with you?" Just for a moment. I didn't know who else. "Of course," she said, stepping aside and ushering him in. He paced once around her front room before sitting heavily in the wingback chair, elbows on knees. "I didn't do it," he said at once. "Whatever people are saying, I didn't. I loved Aunt Millicent, in my own way." Miss Marple waited. She was difficult, controlling, but she meant well. She thought she could save me, thought she could steer me towards something respectable. "Is that why you came back to St. Mildred's?" He hesitated. "In part, but also because I had nowhere else to go. I messed things up in London. Bad investments, bad company. She gave me a second chance." Miss Marple looked at him closely. "You were seen reaching towards something in the grass near where she was found." Freddie paled. I dropped my watch. Slipped from my pocket when I leaned over. "I wasn't stealing anything, I swear it." "Then you won't mind speaking with Inspector Arkwell?" He swallowed hard but nodded. Miss Marple studied him a moment longer. There was fear in his eyes, but not the kind that came from guilt. It was the fear of someone running from more than one thing at a time. After he left, she made a new note in her diary. "Freddie is desperate, not dangerous. More afraid of something than someone." The list was sharpening. The pieces are beginning to shift. Tomorrow she would find a way to speak to Reverend Hale, and she would ask about crosses. Not the ones in the program, but the ones people carried quietly. The kind that weighed heavier than rings. The bells of St. Mildred's Church chimed 10 o'clock, their echoes tumbling gently across the village like stones skipped across a still pond. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage not long after, her footsteps careful on the gravel path. It was a mild morning, one of those rare English days that promised neither rain nor shine but hovered politely in between. The curate, Reverend Edmund Hale, answered the door himself. He looked rather pale, though he smiled as warmly as a man could after 3 sleepless nights and 1 fatal fate. "Miss Marple," he said, with a faint inclination of the head. "What a surprise." "I hope it's not an inconvenience," she replied, her voice light. "Only I found myself quite near and thought to drop in. I've been going through some of the church records at home. My cousin's husband was once clerk of a parish in Hampshire, you know, and I remembered you'd expressed interest in restoring the bell tower. Thought I might offer some suggestions." Reverend Hale blinked. "The bell tower. I do love a bit of old stonework," Miss Marple added serenely. "May I come in?" He stepped aside without further protest, and she followed him into a small, book-lined study. The air smelled faintly of beeswax and ink, and a silver cross gleamed modestly on the mantel. Miss Marple took a seat and folded her hands in her lap. "You must be quite exhausted," she said, "after everything that's happened." Reverend Hale sighed. "It's been a trying time. Miss Tewkesbury's passing must have struck a particular blow. She was such a supporter of the church." He hesitated. Yes, she was." Miss Marple observed him closely. The man seemed genuine, though a touch too cautious, as if measuring every syllable. "You spoke to her at the fete, I believe?" He nodded. "Briefly. She wanted to know if I planned to remain in the parish beyond the year." "And do you?" "I haven't decided. Did she mention Miss Reeves?" Now he looked startled. "Emily?" "No, not in any detail. Why do you ask?" "Oh, just idle curiosity," Miss Marple replied smoothly, "though I do understand she was fond of matchmaking, our dear Millicent, always trying to pair people like gloves in a drawer." Reverend Hale chuckled faintly, but the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. She made a few suggestions. "Yes. None of them are very appropriate." Miss Marple tilted her head. "And did she seem upset when you disagreed with her?" The curate hesitated just a beat too long. I wouldn't be upset. She was persistent, but I made it clear I wasn't looking for companionship. Quite understandable, Miss Marple said. So many people mistake solitude for sadness. Reverend Hale offered a non-committal smile and rose to pour more tea. Miss Marple took the moment to glance at the desk behind him. It was cluttered with parish forms and sermon drafts, but one item caught her eye. A folded white handkerchief, embroidered at the corner with a single, neat letter, M. She said nothing but filed the details away. Outside, she walked slowly through the churchyard, letting her fingers trail along the cool stone of the boundary wall. Her eyes drifted over the names carved into headstones, the moss creeping gently along the edges, like time reclaiming its dues. She paused at the newest grave, Millicent Tewkesbury's. Fresh flowers had been placed there that morning. White lilies, unmarked. Miss Marple crouched, brushing a few leaves aside. Something glinted faintly beneath the lower stem of one of the lilies. She reached down and plucked out a small twisted scrap of wire, thin, no longer than a toothpick, and bent in a peculiar way. It was brass, not silver, and not part of any flower arrangement. She turned it over between her fingers, frowning thoughtfully. It looked like the prong of a clasp, the sort used in lockets or brooches, or perhaps rings. She wrapped it carefully in a handkerchief and placed it in her handbag. By early afternoon, the village green was unusually quiet. Most had retreated indoors, either to speculate in whispers or to avoid being drawn into them. But the silence was not peaceful. It pulsed like a held breath. At the post office, Dora Meacham fidgeted behind the counter, tapping her pencil against the till. "It's the police," she whispered to Mrs. Quince, who was purchasing stamps for a letter she never intended to send. "They came by this morning again, asking about the ring. Still missing, isn't it? And poor Freddie, he's gone into hiding, I hear." Mrs. Quince peered over her glasses. "Do you think he did it?" "I think," Dora said dramatically, "that Millicent knew something about someone she shouldn't have." Miss Marple entered then, with a parcel under her arm and a kind word on her lips. "Oh, Dora, I wonder if you could help me with something. Do you recall if Millicent ever sent anything registered? Something valuable?" "I was thinking about her papers, and I wondered if she might have made arrangements in case of an emergency." Dora's eyes widened. "She did ask me once about a secure post. Asked if it was safe to send jewelry. I told her it's better to use a solicitor." She looked thoughtful and then didn't say anything else. "Curious," Miss Marple said. "Thank you, dear." She exited as smoothly as she had entered. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk, reviewing her growing collection of notes. Freddie, desperate and unstable, but too obvious. Emily, guarded and frightened, with something held tightly in her expression. Lavinia, composed to the point of concealment and disapproving of Millicent's interference. And now Reverend Hale, with a hidden handkerchief and a veiled past. She unwrapped the bent wire again and studied it. Not the kind of thing one found lying about. Certainly not in a flower bed. It had been dropped, possibly even buried in haste. She held it up to the light and noticed a small groove in its center. It had once latched onto something, she was sure, but it was no longer whole. Had it snapped off during a struggle? Had someone tried to remove it from Millicent's hand and broken it in the process? She thought again of the missing ring. Perhaps, she thought slowly, the ring had not been taken to conceal its value, but to conceal what was inside it. What secrets might a woman like Millicent Tewkesbury hide in a ring? A note? A photograph? A name? The notions settled over Miss Marple like a shawl. She picked up her pen and wrote a single word on her page. Why? Then she circled it. Someone had feared what Millicent might reveal, and someone else, perhaps several someones, feared they might be next. The ring, the wire, and the folded program were not just symbols or props. They were part of a mechanism, and Miss Marple, ever methodical, had begun to see how the pieces fit. Tomorrow she will speak to Emily again. Not as a comforter, but as a questioner. Not to console, but to observe. Rain fell that morning, not heavily, but with a steady persistence that blurred the edges of the rooftops and made the cobbled lanes of St Mildred's glisten like oil paintings come to life. It was a damp sort of day, one that drove people indoors and made confessions more likely, simply because silence had nowhere to hide. Miss Marple stood at her window with a cup of tea, watching the village move slowly beneath the grey. People hurried, between doorways with umbrellas, heads down as if trying to keep their thoughts to themselves. She had already made her decision. Today would not be a day for errands or pretense. It was a day for questions. Emily Reeves opened the door on the third knock, her cardigan loose around her shoulders, her eyes tired. She managed a strained smile. Miss Marple. Again, you do make a habit of surprising me. Miss Marple returned the smile with her usual softness. Only when it's needed, my dear. May I come in? Emily stepped aside. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and damp paper. The living room was tidier than before, but the signs of nervous activity remained. A pile of books on the floor, a cushion askew, and a crumpled envelope tucked beneath a coaster as if hastily hidden. Miss Marple took a seat by the fire, pulling her shawl tighter. I hope you don't mind me calling again. I've been thinking about poor Millicent, and of something you said the other day. Emily poured tea with shaking hands. What was that? That you heard a rustling behind the yew? Emily nodded. Yes, I did. And that you thought it sounded like something, or someone moving away from the scene. Her guest nodded again, slowly. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. Do you remember if it sounded hurried, frantic, or measured, deliberate? Emily looked away for a moment. I didn't really think I was in a hurry. Miss Marple set her teacup down gently. Emily, you're frightened. That much is clear. But the trouble with fear is that it keeps growing if you don't name it. If there's something you're not telling the police, something that could help them, then saying it aloud might be the only way to keep yourself safe. Emily swallowed. I don't know what you mean. Don't you? Miss Marple said softly. Because I think you do. I think you know who Millicent was arguing with that morning. I think you saw more than you've admitted. Emily closed her eyes. I didn't mean to listen. I was near the back of the tent, checking the tables. I heard voices. Millicent's and someone else's. A man. He sounded upset, angry. He said something like, "You've no right." And she said, "I have every right. If you won't admit it, someone else must know." Emily opened her eyes. I didn't want to be involved. I've never been part of anything like this. Miss Marple reached out and gently took her hand. No one ever thinks they will be, dear. But here you are, and what you've remembered might be the key. Emily hesitated, then said, It wasn't Freddie. I know his voice. It was calmer, lower. The man she was speaking with was older, more controlled, but angry all the same. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed just slightly. I see, she said. Thank you, Emily. You've helped more than you know. An hour later, Miss Marple sat across from Inspector Arkwell in the station's cramped back room, her umbrella drying in the corner. She's frightened, Inspector, she said plainly. And she's not the only one. This business is pressing on people. It will break soon, I think. But it would be best if we guided it gently before it shatters. Inspector Arkwell rubbed his chin, then leaned forward. You believe someone confronted Miss Tewkesbury at the fete? I do. Someone she knew. Someone who was afraid of being exposed. She had a way of learning things, you know. Things people tried to hide. Arkwell sighed. That could be half the village. Indeed, Miss Marple said, her tone light. But how many men in the village have cause to fear the past, or are they trying very hard to appear blameless in the present? That afternoon, as the rain eased into mist, Miss Marple paid a second visit to Lavinia Drake. The woman opened the door with a thin smile. Back again? Only for a quick question, Miss Marple said cheerfully. You wouldn't happen to know if Millicent kept a diary, would you? Or notes? I imagine she was rather meticulous. Lavinia's eyes narrowed. She did. She kept a little ledger, if I recall. She liked to document her successes, all her little victories in the world of romance. Do you know where it might be? No idea, Lavinia said quickly. Probably in her writing desk, though the police may have taken it by now. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Curious, she said, because I heard Millicent had an argument that day with a man, and yet no one has come forward to say they heard it, except Miss Reeves. Lavinia's composure faltered for a flicker of a second. Then it returned. Well, people are very selective in what they remember. True, said Miss Marple, especially when they're trying to forget. At sunset, Miss Marple made one last stop, this time at the church. Reverend Hale was alone, preparing the altar for evensong. He turned as she entered, surprised. Miss Marple. She approached with unhurried steps, her expression kind. I shan't stay long. I only came to ask one thing. He set the chalice down carefully. Of course. Where did you serve before coming to St Mildred's? The question took him off guard. Why Sussex, a small village near the coast? Quiet. Why do you ask? Because I wondered, Miss Marple said gently, if someone had followed you here, or if you were trying to escape something from there. He blinked. Miss Marple, I assure you I mean no accusation. Only that secrets rarely stay buried, especially when someone like Millicent Tewkesbury decides to start digging. A beat of silence passed between them. She came to me, he said at last, voice low. A week before the fete. She said she had learned something, that a man of the cloth could not live dishonestly. And were you dishonest, Reverend? His hands trembled slightly. I was young. I made a mistake. There was a woman. She thought we'd marry. I left abruptly. There was talk, letters. Her father was a solicitor. It was all very unpleasant. Did Millicent threaten to expose you? She said she would tell the bishop, that my appointment here would be reconsidered. I begged her to reconsider. I said I'd make amends. And did you? I tried. He looked up, shame written in every line of his face. I didn't kill her, he whispered. I know, said Miss Marple quietly. But someone else might have thought she knew more than she did. Or perhaps they thought that if one secret could be uncovered, others might be as well. That night, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her diary open in front of her. The pieces were shifting again. Emily had heard an argument. The curate had a past. Lavinia knew about the ledger, and someone had been watching them all. She turned to the folded program once more. Freddie Cross, Emily Hart, Lavinia Hart, Reverend Hale Cross. She drew a faint line between them all, connecting the names. Then, in the corner of the page, she wrote one more word. Leverage. Because Millicent Tewkesbury had built her matchmaking empire not just on kindness, but on knowledge. And knowledge, misused, could be as deadly as any weapon. Tomorrow, Miss Marple would return to the scene of the crime. She believed something small and overlooked was still waiting to be found. The next morning dawned crisp and cool, with the rain having rinsed the village clean and left behind the unmistakable clarity that followed a storm. The clouds had parted, though the mood in St Mildred's remained heavy, taut with the anticipation that something unseen was beginning to move. Miss Marple rose early, her breakfast a modest boiled egg, toast, and a pot of weak tea, before donning her walking coat and heading once more to the fete grounds. Though the bunting had been taken down and the booths cleared away, the ghost of festivity lingered like perfume on old lace. The grass was still marked with the trample of feet, and the earth beneath the yew tree, though no longer cordoned off, had darkened in hue from recent disturbance. Miss Marple knelt with the ease of someone who had spent a lifetime tending garden borders and examined the area where Millicent had been found. There, nestled just behind the root of the ancient yew, half concealed beneath fallen needles, she spotted something odd in a corner of paper. Not new, not freshly dropped, but weathered. She used a handkerchief to retrieve it. It was a torn page, folded twice, the ink smudged but legible. At the top, in Millicent's distinctive hand, was a list of names again, but unlike the fete program, these bore no hearts or crosses. Instead, each name had a number beside it and, beneath, a note of debts, obligations, and indiscretions. It was, unmistakably, a ledger. Miss Marple's lips pressed into a thin line. This was no romantic game. Millicent had been keeping records not just of love matches and preferences, but of power. Who owed what? Who feared exposure? Who had the most to lose? She folded the note carefully and slipped it into her bag, then rose slowly, glancing toward the vicarage in the distance. There was no doubt now. Millicent Tewkesbury had wielded information, like a scalpel, clean, precise, and capable of cutting deep. But someone had decided to cut back. Word of the discovery, as Miss Marple expected, spread within hours, though she made no mention of the paper to anyone except Inspector Arkwell. He examined it with a grim expression. Well, that changes the shape of things. Or rather, Miss Marple corrected gently, it clarifies the shape that was already there. This was never simply about a missing ring or a family squabble. It was about leverage and fear. She paused. There's something else, Inspector. Whoever took the ring didn't do so to sell it. They took it to remove what was hidden inside it. This list was likely meant to accompany whatever was tucked in the ring's locket. A name, perhaps. A detail. Something Millicent wanted protected or revealed, should anything happen to her. Arkwell nodded slowly. So someone silenced her before she could share it, or before she could share it with the wrong person. That afternoon, Freddie Tewkesbury returned to the village. He walked up the lane toward his aunt's cottage with the uncertain gait of someone unsure whether they were still welcome. The locals watched him from behind net curtains and hedges, judgment suspended but waiting to pounce. Miss Marple, already waiting in the sitting room, greeted him with a nod. You returned. I had to, Freddie said, dropping into the chair opposite her. I couldn't stay away any longer. She offered him tea, which he accepted with the gratitude of a man who hadn't had anything warm in days. I want to be clear, he said. I didn't know about any ledger. I knew she kept notes. She was always scribbling, but I thought they were just observations, little matchmaker musings. Miss Marple gave him a gentle smile. People often pretend not to see what they find uncomfortable, Mr. Tewkesbury. But Millicent was many things, and naive was not one of them. She knew exactly what she was doing when she recorded people's failings. The question is, who was afraid enough to stop her? Freddie's jaw tightened. You think I'm still a suspect? I think you are desperate, Miss Marple said kindly, and desperation can look a great deal like guilt. He ran a hand through his hair. You don't know what it was like being here, trying to rebuild, knowing everyone saw me as a failure. And she had this way of reminding me of every mistake, even when she said she meant well. But you didn't kill her. No, he said fiercely, and I'll do anything to prove that. Miss Marple studied him for a moment. Then tell me, she said softly, what did you see behind the cake tent? His eyes darted to hers, wide. How did you do? I know you were there, she said, and I believe you saw something. He hesitated, then leaned forward. I saw Lavinia. She was near the back, just standing there. She looked like she was listening in. I thought it was strange, but then she turned and walked off quickly. Didn't say a word. Miss Marple left shortly, after, her thoughts racing as she walked through the village. She stopped by the cemetery once more, and this time, as she stood at Millicent's grave, she noticed something odd. The lilies had been changed. Not replaced, changed. One of the outer petals on a fresh bloom had been marked faintly with fingerprint smudges. Whoever had come had done so recently, and hurriedly. Someone was still trying to control the story, to erase evidence. That evening, as the sun slid behind the hills, Miss Marple knocked quietly on the door of Lavinia Drake's cottage. Lavinia answered with an air of impatience. Miss Marple. Another chat? If you don't mind, Miss Marple said, stepping inside. It's about Millicent. Of course, Lavinia said coolly. Everyone's talking about her again. And you were seen near the cake tent, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unrelenting. Lavinia stiffened. I went to fetch napkins. I forgot to tell the police. Miss Marple tilted her head. Or perhaps you saw something you didn't want to admit. Something that would place you in the middle of the scene. Lavinia's jaw tightened. She threatened me, she said at last. She said she had written down things about me, about my past. What things? She knew I'd been married, Lavinia whispered. That I left my husband in disgrace, that he'd been arrested. Embezzlement, fraud. I came here to begin again. I kept my name and pretended I'd never been married. She said she wouldn't tell anyone unless she thought I was a danger to others. Miss Marple nodded gently. And so you feared what she might say. I didn't kill her, Lavinia said. But I didn't stop what happened either. I saw the argument. I saw who was with her. Who? Lavinia's eyes filled with reluctant tears. Reverend Hale. Miss Marple said nothing. Lavinia drew a shaky breath. He didn't push her. He didn't lay a hand on her. But she accused him of being a liar, of hiding something in his past. He looked so furious. And then he left. I thought that was the end of it. Miss Marple's expression was unreadable. But someone else had heard too, Lavinia added. Someone who had everything to lose. And who was that? But Lavinia shook her head. I don't know. Only that they must have come shortly after and taken the ring, maybe even what was hidden inside it. Back at home, Miss Marple lit a small lamp and sat in silence. The pieces were almost in place now. The ring, the ledger, the grave, the list of secrets. Someone had been watching everything unfold, and someone had taken the final step. Tomorrow, she will return to the fete grounds one last time. But not alone. She would bring the inspector and someone else. Because the final test was near and the killer had begun to believe they were safe. They weren't. The following morning, the village was quiet in the way a theater is quiet just before the curtain rises. The clouds were thinning, pale light sifting down onto the green, illuminating the traces of fate, bunting still tangled in the branches of the chestnut trees. It was the kind of day when the air felt charged, not with weather, but with something more intangible. Anticipation. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived at the fete grounds accompanied by Inspector Arkwell and Reverend Edmund Hale. The inspector had been briefed and the curate summoned under the pretense of reviewing plans for a memorial service in Miss Tewkesbury's honor. He looked uneasy, shifting his weight as they walked toward the edge of the green where the yew tree stood like a brooding sentinel. Miss Marple moved slowly, her expression serene as always, though every movement she made was deliberate. The grass beneath their feet was soft and forgiving, and the lingering traces of recent foot traffic were barely visible now, hidden under nature's quiet reordering. I thought it best, she said, as they reached the yew's gnarled roots, to return to the scene. It's curious, isn't it? how places hold things, not just objects, but impressions. Reverend Hale offered a polite but confused smile. I'm not sure I follow. Miss Marple gestured lightly to the spot where Millicent Tewkesbury had been found. You were seen speaking with her that morning, she said gently. And later, Lavinia Drake saw you again, angry, alarmed. Hale opened his mouth to protest, but Miss Marple raised a hand. I don't believe you harmed her, but I do believe your confrontation was not the only one that morning. You weren't the only person with something to hide. She turned to Inspector Arkwell and nodded. You may bring him now. The inspector disappeared for a moment, returning with young Freddie Tewkesbury in tow. He looked pale, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. His face bore a wary sort of defiance, the expression of someone determined not to run anymore. Reverend Hale looked surprised. Freddie? What's the meaning of this? I thought it would be useful, Miss Marple said, for all the players to be present, because something happened here that morning, something that had very little to do with money, or anger, or even shame. It had to do with exposure and fear. She opened her handbag and drew out the folded slip of paper she had discovered behind the U. She handed it to Arkwell, who unfolded it slowly and held it up for the others to see. Millicent's ledger. Reverend Hale blinked at the names, his face losing its color. She kept track, Miss Marple continued, of people's secrets, their sins, and their regrets. But she wasn't cruel, not truly. She saw herself as a steward of truth, and perhaps she believed that keeping those truths in order meant keeping the village in order. She turned her gaze toward Freddie now, whose hands tightened into fists at his sides. You came back to St. Mildred's because you needed her. She took you in and paid your bills. But she also reminded you, didn't she, of everything you'd done wrong, of how far you'd fallen. And when she threatened to cut you off, Freddie shook his head fiercely. No, he said. She didn't. That's not how it happened. Then tell us, Miss Marple said softly. He looked around at Hale, at Arkwell, and then back at Miss Marple. She found something, he said slowly. Something in the post. A letter. It was meant for someone else, I think. But it came to her by mistake. I don't know how. She never said, only that what it revealed was deeply improper. I thought at first she meant me. But when I asked her, she said it involved someone she once trusted. She said she had to think carefully about what to do. And did she mention who it was? Arkwell asked. Freddie looked toward Reverend Hale. She wouldn't say, but I think it was him. Reverend Hale's face had grown ashen. Miss Marple stepped closer now. She may have believed you were engaged in something inappropriate, or hiding something about your past, but you were not the only one in her sights. There was another. She turned back to Arkwell. Did the police recover any of Millicent's personal effects? Diaries? Correspondence? Some, Arkwell said, but not a diary. She had one, Miss Marple said. A private one. It's missing. Just as the ring was missing. I believe whoever took the ring also took the diary. To protect themselves. She let the words hang in the air. Then, without turning her head, she said, Emily, you may come forward now. From behind the bandstand, a figure emerged, small, trembling, but upright. Emily Reeves. She walked slowly toward them, stopping a few paces away. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth drawn. I didn't mean to, she said, her voice barely audible. I didn't plan it. I didn't even know what I was doing until afterward. There was a long silence. Reverend Hale stared at her in horror. Freddie looked stunned. She found out, Emily continued, about me and Edmund. It was true. We were never involved. Not properly. But she saw something read into it, or perhaps she just knew I wanted something I couldn't have. She confronted me. He said I was a danger to him and to myself. She said she'd have me removed from the school, that she'd ruin everything. Tears welled in her eyes, but they did not fall. I tried to reason with her, but she wouldn't listen. She said she had already written it in her diary, that she'd locked it in a place no one would find. She looked up at Miss Marple. I didn't mean to kill her. I didn't even know I had. I just pushed her to stop her from leaving. She fell. It was so fast. I didn't think she'd stop. Breathtaking. I took the ring because she'd always fiddled with it when talking about secrets. I thought maybe it held something. A clue to where she kept her diary. Inspector Arkwell stepped forward slowly, hand resting on his belt. "Where is the ring now, Miss Reeves?" Emily looked away. "I buried it, behind the school garden shed. I couldn't bring myself to destroy it." Arkwell signaled to a constable waiting nearby. Miss Marple, ever composed, stepped back and folded her hands. "There is no villainy quite so human," she said softly, "as fear. We tell ourselves it's protection, that we are merely saving our own lives, but fear twists the truth, and in doing so, it often leads us straight to the thing we feared most." Emily stood silently as the constable approached. She didn't resist. She only looked at Reverend Hale once, her expression filled with a sorrow far deeper than regret. Miss Marple turned to Arkwell. She was never malicious, only lost. The danger came not from hatred, but from panic. Arkwell nodded. "You saw it before anyone else did." "I only listened," Miss Marple said gently. The rest was written on their faces. As Emily was led away, the clouds parted fully above, and sunlight poured across the green in bright golden strokes. It was over. But in St. Mildred's, peace never returned without first learning what price had been paid to disturb it. The next day dawned with the kind of sunshine that makes one question whether the previous week's gloom ever happened at all. Birds chirped with unwarranted cheerfulness, and the village green looked once again like a place of laughter, gossip, and lemon drizzle cake, rather than the backdrop to whispered secrets and quiet tragedy. But in St. Mildred's, peace always came with a sigh rather than a song, and the events of the fete had left an impression not easily smoothed over. In the window of the post office, Dora Meacham rearranged the display of commemorative stamps, her fingers slower than usual. She was still digesting the news of how sweet little Miss Reeves, the schoolmistress who wore sensible shoes and blushed when complimented, could have caused such a dreadful thing. The revelation had left the village breathless for nearly a full day, a record by St. Mildred's standards. Behind lace curtains, doors cracked ajar. Conversation swirled. Not loud, not excited, but low, curious, and careful. Miss Marple, for her part, declined invitations for tea, luncheon, and bridge that morning. She sat instead by the fire in her parlor, her knitting untouched, her eyes drifting between the garden beyond her window and the closed notebook on her lap. There had been no pleasure in seeing the truth unfold. She had always approached such matters as a gardener approaches tangled ivy, not to gloat in cutting it away, but to prevent the ruin of all that might have grown beneath it. A knock at the door roused her. It was Inspector Arkwell, cap in hand, his coat unbuttoned. "May I come in, Miss Marple?" "Of course, Inspector. I've just put the kettle on." She led him to the drawing room, where they sat surrounded by porcelain teacups and the faint smell of scones that had gone untouched since breakfast. Arkwell glanced toward the notebook on her lap. "I imagine that contains more deductions than my entire case file." Miss Marple smiled softly. "Only the bits others prefer to overlook." The inspector leaned forward, folding his hands together. She confessed. "There's no doubt now. The ring was exactly where she said. The diary, too, tucked inside a tin beneath the school garden. It's all there, her intentions, her fears." Millicent knew more than she let on. "Yes," said Miss Marple, her voice quiet. "But she didn't deserve to die for it. No, Arkwell agreed. She didn't. They sat in silence for a few moments. I'm still curious about one thing, the inspector said. Why did Millicent mark Emily with a heart? She clearly didn't approve of her by the end. Miss Marple lifted the notebook and opened it to list the fate program with the symbols. She had a system, Miss Marple explained, but I don't believe the hearts meant approve, as everyone thought. Nor did the crosses mean disapproval. I believe they marked something else entirely. She turned the page. She used hearts to identify people she thought could be influenced or persuaded. People are still uncertain of their paths. Crosses, however, were for those she considered resolved, set in their ways, either for good or ill. Arkwell nodded slowly. So Emily wasn't someone Millicent approved of, but someone she believed she could shape. Exactly, said Miss Marple. She saw Emily as pliable, vulnerable. She meant to help her, but in doing so she pressed too hard, and Emily, already ashamed of her desires and frightened by the scrutiny, lashed out. Tragic, the inspector murmured. Miss Marple nodded. Indeed. Arkwell took a slow sip of tea, then set the cup down gently. The curate's passed, he said. We've confirmed the story. Nothing criminal, just unbecoming. A youthful entanglement and a father with a reputation to protect. Still, the bishop may have a word or two to say about it. I imagine so, said Miss Marple with no particular inflection. And Lavinia Drake? Ah, Miss Marple said, a faint glint returning to her eyes. Now there's a woman who has spent her life curating respectability like a display case. She's committed no crime, Inspector, but she's likely to spend the rest of her days wondering how close she came to being exposed. And perhaps she'll be a little less eager to judge others now. Arkwell sighed. A village like this is so small, and yet so full of shadows. Miss Marple looked out the window, where a bird pecked at the edge of a garden bed. Human nature doesn't scale with population, Inspector. Whether in a city or a village, the fears, resentments, and longings remain the same. They simply echo louder in small places. By afternoon, the schoolhouse stood locked and empty. A notice had been pinned to the door, written in the vicar's careful hand, announcing that Miss Reeves would not be returning, and a temporary replacement would be sought from Much Benham. No one lingered to read it twice. The fete grounds had returned to grass and field. The sweet stall was gone, the coconuts cleared. Yet beneath the roots of the yew tree and the shadow of the church bell tower, something lingered since the land remembered. Children played there again 2 days later, tentatively, at first, as though stepping into a room after a quarrel. But laughter returned, as it always does. At the grocer's, Mr. Blenkinsop resumed his debates over whether plums could be trusted in puddings. Dora Meacham, predictably, offered a new theory every Tuesday, each more inventive than the last, and Lavinia Drake, though never quite as commanding as before, held her head high during the next Women's Guild meeting, where the topic ironically was discretion and the virtues of silence. One evening, several days after Emily's quiet departure from St. Mildred's, Miss Marple sat on her garden bench with a cup of warm milk, wrapped in her shawl as dusk pressed gently around the ivy-clad cottage. She watched as the lights in the village windows blinked on one by one. Domestic scenes unfolded like shadow plays behind curtains. Someone reading aloud, a pair of hands drying dishes, and a cat leaping onto a windowsill. Peace had returned in its own manner. It was never perfect, it was never whole. But it was enough. She reached into her basket and retrieved a half-finished square of knitting. Her hands worked slowly and steadily. Because even when things appear quiet, the work of mending never ends, especially when the fabric is human nature itself.